We're in the midst of a huge transformation where peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, and I'm the Partnerships and Community Manager here at AllVoices, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. Today, I'm really excited to welcome our next guest onto the show, Winston Clements. He's a culture specialist, award-winning business and motivational speaker. Winston, if you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, including your pronouns, and when you were younger, do you remember how you answered the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Yeah, great question. And thank you for having me. My name is Winston Clements. My pronouns are he, him, and his. And I guess just to give a brief background on myself, I think I'll describe myself as a inclusion advocate. So for me, inclusion and diversity are topics which are, I guess, really close to my heart and I guess things that I hold passionately, particularly when it comes to the intersections between disability and race. And I guess I have a personal invested interest in that, being a person with lived experience of disability and also coming from a ethnic minority, with my parents having African heritage and I guess all the quirks that come with navigating a Western society when you're from those backgrounds. And then maybe kind of taking it, a step back. So before I got into my passion into this, disability, inclusion, equity world, I was actually doing something completely different. I was a software engineer. So I worked in the tech industry, studied computer science. I was a pretty decent programmer, I'd like to think, and worked with different organizations, helping them create systems and create platforms to deliver business outcomes. So this feels like I've done a massive 180, to transform from the technical into doing what I do today, working with people more than I work with computers. And then just to finish with that question, when I was younger, I was thinking about this, and I think the first thing that I remember wanting to be growing up was to become an artist. So I'd like to say I was pretty good artist. So particularly when it came to pencil drawing, I love doing all of that kind of thing, the shading and, just creating beautiful sketches and drawings on paper. And so if you were to take me back to ages 5, 6, 7, I think I saw myself eventually becoming a full-time artist. But, as I mentioned, things change over time. I kind of went into technology side of things and then now into diversity, equity, inclusion. But actually, when I think of the common thread with all of those things, I think there's something there about creativity, and wanting to shape the spaces that I'm in, whether through art or through technology or through, creating cultures that feel more inclusive for everyone.
Absolutely. I think there's definitely that common thread of creativity, especially in this space. And you talked about, identifying as an inclusion advocate, your lived experiences. And I would love to dig in a little bit deeper to ask how you think your, personal journey has really led you up until this point and where you are today, your why, if you will.
Yeah, yeah. And yeah, and maybe it'd be useful to share a bit more. So with my personal experience, I guess out of all the aspects of my identity, I think maybe the one that is most pronounced is the fact that I am a person with a disability. So I was born with a condition, Christina, known as osteogenesis imperfecta, which, if you've not come across it before, just means my bones fracture much easier than the average person. And so I think we tried to work this out one time and figured out that I'd fractured over 200 times in my lifetime, which is it's a lot for anyone who's listening, and you fractured anything
Yeah.
at any time, then you'll appreciate doing it hundreds of times is pretty heavy. And so I guess the other ways that it impacts me is it also really impacts in how I look. So I am much smaller than the average person. I'm 3 foot tall and I use a wheelchair. And so I think because of having, that very different look, and I normally stand out in every room that I'm in. I think one of the things that I've started to figure out from a young age, whether it's in the school environment or in the workplace was I started to be aware that I needed to find ways to help people feel comfortable around me. And it made sense when I read a piece of research recently, which is a piece of UK research, but I believe it probably there's probably similar research all around the world that said 67% of people find it uncomfortable speaking to or being around people with disabilities, right? And I think as I started to, maybe that's something that I was aware of without knowing, the data behind it. And so I always remember from a young age, being very observant, looking at how people were approaching me and speaking to me, noticing the hesitations, noticing the discomfort, and then thinking or looking within myself to find ways of helping that person, helping us build a relationship with each other, whether it's in the school environment, work environment, social, whatever. And so and that could be through, a number of different means. It could be through using humor. I like to think I'm quite funny, or, just being proactive and, if I notice someone perhaps wants to speak to me, but they're hesitating, then perhaps I'm more proactive and I just take the opportunity to say hello first. So yeah, and so, when I think about that background, particularly with the disability side of things, it's actually not so different, Christina, to what I'm doing today in terms of helping organizations create, those, I guess, easier interactions and cultures where people can relate to each other in an easy way, through noticing and being aware and celebrating the different aspects of their people, and I guess moving away from stigmas or things that do not serve this goal of inclusion, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And I definitely want to thank you for kind of sharing your personal journey to this work. And also, I think that's a huge kind of onus on individuals who identify as folks who have disabilities or a part of a minority group as well, to kind of make people feel comfortable and be aware of that. And I think it's interesting that workplaces are really, from my idealistic perspective, they want to kind of be proactive and lean into being more equitable, having these conversations. And in your work, I want to ask too, what's the next problem or situation you're currently trying to solve, knowing that every organization is at a different part of its journey of inclusion?
Yeah, and yeah, I mean, there's a long list, but I think the one that feels really present to me right now, and maybe not necessarily, specifically work related, but something that I've been thinking about now is the role of relationships. And I know we're going to sort of dive into relationships a bit later. But one thing that came up for me, or has been coming up for me recently, is just the idea of relationships, particularly romantic relationships, and how that plays out in a disability context. So
Okay.
maybe the reason why I've been thinking about this, Christina, you might know, but I've got a YouTube channel with my
Yeah.
wife. So we started this channel. Actually, we got married about a year ago, at the time of this recording. And initially we created this platform on YouTube, Christina, just to share, a couple of videos with family members, because it's always easier just to send a link than try and send a whole wedding video file to a friend or family member. So we created this channel, uploaded a couple of videos, from our special moments at the wedding. But then what started to happen was that, we started getting discovered, which wasn't the original intention of the channel. It was more something for our friends and family. And so, long story short, in the space of basically about a year, we've gone from, a brand new channel to a channel with over 100,000 followers. And I think one of the things that started to pop up and to become noticeable for us was that, we were getting, a lot of comments, most of them positive, but there was still a number of comments there that were suggested that people still had a lot of biases when it comes to disability and relationships. So even the idea that a person with a disability, would get married or, expect to start a family, have kids, enjoy romantic relationships. We got a lot of comments questioning that, and some pretty, negative comments as well, saying basically that this should not be allowed to happen, which was surprising for us because we are in, a work society with all the information that we have at the moment. And so I guess, maybe Christina, that's why this is so present for me and my wife. So we've taken the proactive step of actually starting to address some of these topics, some of these taboos, such as, relationships, families, day-to-day life, of a person who is differently abled, being differently abled in the workplace, and create video content that kind of brings that to life and hopefully raises some awareness that challenges some of the stigmas and prejudices that people still surprisingly hold, in this day and age.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I've definitely seen your YouTube channel before with your wife, and I think you're right, relationships. And I think that especially right now, relationships of all kinds are kind of melding together, especially as corporate kind of America was forced into like a remote first environment as well. It's just you can't separate those things out. I do want to ask about another kind of video I saw you in your TED talk about unconscious bias. Who are you excluding? Where you talk about relationships and social capital as a really important piece of creating inclusive spaces. And in a remote first world where you're not running into people in the bathroom, in the kitchen, you don't have those common spaces. How can companies really support employees in creating social capital and fostering meaningful connections that are maybe not on a forced Zoom happy hour or, one of those things?
Yeah, definitely. And I think you're right, on the point that you just mentioned, in terms of maybe what relationships are, today, during the pandemic are different to what they were pre-pandemic. So I think we've almost managed to go behind the curtain and see more layers that make up a person than perhaps we would have in a pre-pandemic world, even just by, me looking at your Zoom screen right now. I can tell that you love to read because you've got a bookshelf behind you. You've got, you're a plant mom as well. So I can tell these details just by looking at your Zoom screen
Yeah.
versus perhaps before, where we meet in a sterile office environment and we're not able to build that level of connection.
Yeah.
But just to build on the social capital thing, and maybe it might help to give a bit of context. So I think this idea comes from, I think it comes from the field of social anthropology. So this is, basically just the study of humans, right? And there's a particular specialist, a guy called Professor Robin Dunbar. I believe he's a British professor, and he argued, in one of his studies, that the average human being has access to about 150 social connections. So when we say social connections, we're talking about, it could be a friend, it could be a family member, it could be a coworker, that person that you like to have coffee with or virtual coffee with, nowadays. And so with that study as well, so that's the average person. The average person has about 150 of those social touch points. But then when the same study was applied to people with disabilities, it was found that people from this community only have about 25 of those connection points. So remember, the average, able-bodied person has 150, and the person who is differently abled has 25. So already you can see there's a pretty big disparity. And so why is this important? Why does this matter? So when we apply it in an organizational context, Christina, and I think when I was thinking about this during my TED talk, I was thinking from a recruitment perspective, especially. So there's a lot of data that you can find that show that about 50% of job roles, so when it comes to hiring, about 50% of job roles are filled by referral, right? So that's, you know, a friend who works for a company, And so the next time you're looking for an opportunity, you just reach out to them informally and they can
Yeah.
refer you for that job, right? That's how 50% of hiring typically works. And so to kind of just bring it back to this idea of social connections and social capital, if 50% of, of this, and this is just in a hiring context, of the opportunities within this context are filled basically because of your social network, your social capital, then you can see that if you're a member of a minority group, like a person with a disability, for example, straight away, like 50% of the job market is mostly unavailable to you, right? Because remember, you have far less social connections than the average able-bodied person. So I guess to kind of bring it back to, thinking about now and what companies can do to support employees to create social capital. It's an interesting one. So of course there's applications and platforms that we can explore. And just to name a few that I've seen work really well. So thinking about I guess at the pre-onboarding stage. So this is at that stage before you join a company. And applying this to my own experience, because when I worked in tech, for example, I was fortunate to work for a number of different companies within the tech industry. And I remember whenever I joined a new organization, after receiving my job offer, there was often maybe a month to 3 months of a gap before I joined that team,
Mhm.
right? And so I've seen companies nowadays really take advantage of that gap to really start to build those connections through technology. There's a platform that I've come across called Holaroo, which is basically a platform that companies, I've seen a couple of companies use, where a person who's accepted an offer can join in, can log onto the app, and then they can start building those connections. They can have access to bios and photos and even videos of team members doing introductions. And they could even start to message team members using instant messaging features, um, just to start to build up that familiarization before they actually step into the building and become a official team member themselves. So for me, that's a way of building social capital, and I think that's still relevant today, in a virtual setting. Um, of course, we all know about, like you said, the Zoom happy hours and the coffee roulettes,
Yep.
which I think are pretty cool as well. They definitely have their place, particularly at a time when many people are joining companies, and not able to meet their colleagues in person. So I think they help a little bit as well. And then I also think, even with the great work that you do at AllVoices, um, because it's not just about, having fun and like having cocktails on Zoom. I think it should also be about creating safe spaces. And what I love about the platform is just having that opportunity or that way of sharing feedback, asking questions, raising grievances in a way that feels safe, right? Or asking questions in a way where you do not fear repercussions or negative consequences. So I think having that as well is particularly important at this time, because then that also instills this psychological safety in these connected environments that we find ourselves in.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate that feedback as well. And we know that creating these connections is not only about the fun stuff, but it's about creating those safe spaces and making sure that we're able to have hard conversations as well. And I appreciate the foundation you laid to answer that question. There's so much research out there that says when people say the playing field is level for everyone, it's just not. And it's important for people to recognize that. And when you're trying to make sure that people feel connected, there are resources out there like the platforms you mentioned to help facilitate that. You don't need to reinvent the wheel, but you need to be specific. Once you have that foundation, you have the research as well. You can't just say we want everyone to be friends at the company. That's not how that works. So I do want to be specific and ask about inclusive spaces for employees with varying abilities, which we've touched on a little bit in the conversation as well. In the United States specifically, I've seen some research around how people with varying abilities or disabilities are the largest minority population in the United States of around 50 million individuals. And it's really the only, I've heard this on the panel as well, the only minority that anyone can become a part of at any time in their life, which I think is interesting. And I want to ask how workplaces can be more proactive as opposed to reactive and creating inclusive spaces for employees with these varying abilities. I've heard kind of different opinions, whether, remote first is like really beneficial because you're able to make accommodations, but also our companies doing that. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, honestly, there's so many like tactical things that may or may not work depending, because disability is also a spectrum,
Right.
right? So, we could talk about remote first, but that may be a good avenue perhaps for neurodiversity, but perhaps, less helpful for different types of, disability as well. So there's definitely not a one size fits all with that, but
Right.
the things that pop to my mind is, and this first one is like super simple, but because the way I approach this is, what would I look for when thinking about joining a company or when thinking about collaborating a company, in order to feel accommodated myself, being a person who's differently abled. And, first one, super simple. I'd be attracted to companies that say that they welcome applicants from, people who are differently abled. Even just having that as a statement, of course, a commitment, signing up to some kind of charter. I think we have various employee charters in different countries. I know we have stuff here in the UK where a company can sign up and, and almost, publicly declare their commitment to onboarding and to attracting people with disabilities. So I think that helps a little bit because already I feel comfortable being on your website. I feel comfortable wanting to learn more about the role because I have a small sense that you want me to be part of that team, right? And then, but that's only the beginning, right? Because as we know, that could also become a little bit tick boxy, or organizations may just say something because it's fashionable to say so, or to appear inclusive when perhaps the culture is not so inclusive. So I think what takes it further is actually just having things in place, right? And so so where do you start? So obviously there's the practical side of things, things which are probably obvious even for a person who doesn't have lived experience with disability, but just being aware of those things like accessibility, providing or making available assistive technology. So just things like braille keyboards, sign language interpretations, and maybe a really simple one, but even just enabling the captions, the closed captions on Zoom, I think is a massive win. And actually, not just for people with disabilities, I found that that works well for people who do not have English as a first language, because they might find it harder to keep up with the verbal, but they can catch up with the written captions. So that one is honestly a really leveraged one. The other one I can think of when it comes to creating inclusive environments for people with varying abilities is just creating communities as well, within organizations. Communities, of course, where, you know, people with disabilities and disability is celebrated. And so that can be through, storytelling. It could be through people within leadership or just various team members sharing their own story, whether as people with lived experience or people with caregiving experience. Because at some point, like you say, we've all come across, or we've all had a touch point with somebody um, who is connected to this community of people with disabilities. So it's sharing those stories, right? In the UK, we've got Disability History Month coming up, so which is like the equivalent, almost of like Black History Month or Pride Month, but from a disability perspective. So really honoring and capitalizing on those periods of time to raise awareness and again to to create opportunities for your people to learn and grow in this area. And then I think polling your employees as well. And again, this might be a cool way of getting that feedback, through a tool like AllVoices, and really gauging the pulse of the things that they would like to build awareness on, because there are various topics within disability. Disability is such a huge thing, right? And I sometimes hesitate to give advice because, like I said, it's not a one size fits all. So it's really polling your people and seeing what's present for them. Seeing, you might have, for example, a bigger community of caregivers, right, within your organization. And so it's maybe topics relating to caregiving. You might have um, things that have come up around inclusive language, around ableism, or you might have a community of people with hidden impairments, right? And so as you poll and as you get that feedback, you can then tailor the events, you can tailor the community and your disability inclusion roadmap around those things so that your people are getting what they need.
And that's the key, right? People getting what they need as well. And it sounds like there are a lot of tactical strategies that you can implement tomorrow. It's very much a long-term process as well, but you never want to assume what people need and want to. So it's definitely important to ask for feedback, not a one-size-fits-all approach. And as you mentioned, disability or varying abilities are in different forms as well. So you might not know that somebody has a varying ability because they might not be comfortable in sharing that yet. As you mentioned, there are different ways that you can make sure people feel included before they enter a company and while they're there as well. And I want to ask your opinion. We've talked a little bit about this too in terms of asking employees. How do you see employee feedback management as like a really important tool to build company culture overall, in that culture of listening? And how do you see that kind of manifesting at really successful organizations?
Yeah, honestly, I think it kind of builds on what we've touched on, and I think it also builds on this idea of allyship. So allyship has become one of those buzzy words within D&I, I think. Every, every other word is allyship when it comes to D&I. But I think this idea of allyship is super important because, if we think of allyship, at its most simplistic level, we're just saying, we want to, we all want to be in a place or in an environment, in a culture where we're looking out for each other, right? So we're not just looking out for ourselves, but we're looking out for each other. And the reason why I think, employee feedback builds on that is because, where allyship can fail is, we know what to do. We know that we need to look out for each other, but we don't always do it, right? You have a situation that happens. It could be, to use a famous example, it could be something like what happened last year with George Floyd and that terrible tragedy that we all witnessed. And I had colleagues, people who work for various organizations reaching out to me and saying, hey, you know what, this was really tough. And what made it even harder was that, nobody in my team addressed it. It wasn't mentioned by my manager. It wasn't mentioned by my leader. And because of that, it didn't feel safe for me to come forward and say, actually, that situation really affected me, affected my mental health or affected me on a personal level because I am from this community or I have an affinity for this community. And so, with employee feedback, I feel like it starts to address some of those gaps where allyship might not happen, either because we don't do it, we won't do it, or we don't know what to say, right? So allyship gives a voice almost to the voiceless. Employee feedback gives voice to the voiceless, because for that person who was feeling like, hey, I wish my manager would check in with me about this situation, this social justice situation. It might just be an oversight by their manager, right? But employee feedback allows that to be captured. in a useful way, and even in an anonymous way, because for some people they might have this thought but feel again uncomfortable raising it, and so if somebody else doesn't raise it for them, it might just get missed completely. So employee feedback allows us to capture those things, and then it still requires action, but at least it addresses the capture part of things.
Absolutely. And I think there is an accountability piece to that as well, because when we're talking about employee feedback management or EFMP, if you're giving that to the company, instead of it being anecdotal or just hearing through the grapevine, you actually have this information. So there's really no way you can say, well, I didn't know, or, we didn't do anything about it because it was just something that was heard from someone else. Some folks you mentioned a few times around anonymous feedback are afraid to capture it from employees for a multitude of reasons. Again, everybody at a different stage of their journey in creating company culture, but why is it important to offer anonymous feedback for folks to provide kind of their thoughts?
Yeah, I think definitely, going back to what we were saying about psychological safety, I think that's really important. In terms of, if I raise something, then there's not going to be, or if I show up in an authentic way, I'm not going to face any negative consequences. So that's one. I think the other is, almost to address um, just different, I want to call them personality styles almost, because some people are very vocal and able to raise things verbally. Um, that comes to them naturally. It's an aptitude that they have. Whereas for other people, that might feel a lot more challenging, or it might just not be their natural way. Almost like some people, in the same way that some people like to make phone calls and other people prefer to text, right? So in the same way with feedback, and especially anonymous feedback, it allows different avenues for people to voice issues, concerns, ideas, in a way that feels congruent with their personality style. So for me, those are the two that pop to my mind right now. How can I find a way to be authentic, and not face consequences? And if I do decide to share some feedback, do I have options in the way that I deliver it?
Yeah, I think that definitely makes sense. Authenticity is key. I often hear and definitely have personal experiences in being super authentic and honest in exit interviews, but at the end of the day, you kind of want that authenticity before that period of time with your team. You mentioned that everybody is different. We know that, not every employee is the same, but at the end of the day, companies want to measure their company culture and know that they have a healthy one, or a low bar is not a toxic one. But what are qualitative and quantitative ways you can measure company culture in your mind, and or employee happiness?
Yeah, I've got an interesting one for you, Christina. So, when it comes to qualitative, one of the methods that I've found, interesting, and maybe, maybe you've come across this before, but it's something that I call the Foyer test. So, it's something that I've done before. So, when I've been asked to go and do some training for an organization, for example, or, deliver a talk to address a specific, um, you know, diversity and inclusion topic, one of the things that I like to do is, make some time, before the day of the talk, just to, or arrive early on the day and just sit in the foyer of the organization, right? And just sit there, do some people watching, listen in on the conversations that people are having, um, with each other as colleagues, or, the types of exchanges that are happening. Look at how people are, communicating and treating, the person at reception, or, the person at security, right? And with that, you start to pick up little clues about, the culture, and about the employee happiness, about you might catch someone, complaining about a particular thing. You might say, actually, the canteen, always serving food that I don't like, for example, and you just start to get little clues that paint a little picture of the culture. And so this is something that I'd actually encourage people within organizations, those that are passionate about inclusivity. And you don't have to sit in the foyer like me. It's easy for me because nobody recognizes me because I'm an outsider coming into an organization. Um, but just really being proactive in not just hearing but listening, right? So catching everything that almost reading between the lines of what people are saying, right? Looking at how they're saying, looking at checking in with people, not just from a work perspective, but also from a personal perspective, so that you can build awareness and catch things that are going on outside of work, right? So for me, that four-year test is really important. And then, of course, we have, I guess, the more quantitative um, tools. You've got your employee feedback surveys, which I remember when I worked for organizations, they were my least favorite thing to do, like pages and pages of, questions. But I think, there is a place for them. Um, and I think it's also, for those that create these tools to capture the feedback, I think it becomes frustrating, from my perspective, I'll speak. It becomes frustrating if you're doing a annual employee feedback survey in 2020, and then in 2021 you still feel like that same feedback point was never addressed. So I
Right.
think that's when it starts to feel like a wasted exercise. So for those that collect this data, it's making sure that they're really visible in showing the actions that come out of that data. I think that's really important to employee happiness. And maybe I'll throw in a superficial thing as well, in terms of even things like employee, I guess industry awards, I think are they're superficial, but for me, they're an indicator of when a company is heading in the right direction. So, of course, we have the list of best places to work or most inclusive organizations, those type of things. I think when a company is constantly showing up on those lists, it means that they are doing something right to move themselves forward with employee happiness and with inclusion.
Yeah, absolutely. And they care about investing in resources to do that as well, and making sure that they are an employer of choice for people who are researching them as well. And I think that is important too. What you talked about for surveys as what one point in time, pulsing employees, which is important, but it's one kind of layer to get that trust from employees to get the feedback. But if you don't do anything about it, the odds of getting that next time are pretty slim. I want to ask in kind of our final two questions around trends you're seeing in companies who are kind of reaching out to you. I'm sure that
Yeah.
a lot of folks, as you mentioned, have been reaching out. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, a focus on allyship and training and just storytelling in general. I think a lot of folks are reaching out, but what are your thoughts on what you've been seeing as to why, or what people are looking for?
Mm. Yeah, I think definitely all of those things you listed. I think the other one that I've seen, sort of come back to the top of people's minds is inclusive language. So I think just being aware of language, and I think language can be one of the things that really causes people not to speak out um, or to share their thoughts and ideas around inclusion because they're afraid of saying the wrong thing,
Mhm.
right? Particularly leaders who don't want to be seen as making a mistake or using language that isn't acceptable. So I've seen a lot of requests for you know understanding inclusive language, understanding how even language that is no longer acceptable, maybe language that you might be using at home or with your friends outside of work that may not actually be serving its purpose in the workplace. So inclusive language best practices is definitely a big area that I'm seeing. Intersectionality is another one, which is it's always somewhere near the top. And I think as we are widening our understanding of, diversity, equity, inclusion, we're starting to realize that it's no longer just a case of, ticking boxes. In fact, all the boxes, they're kind of one box, they all overlap with each other. And it's really I'm starting to see a lot of companies embrace this idea of it's actually not boxes, but one box with different layers, right? And so intersectionality is becoming a big piece of that. And again, extending even more in the pandemic world, because like we talked about earlier, we get to see people not just for their, their employee face, we also get to have a glimpse of their personal life as well. And so intersectionality kind of bleeds into all of that, and thinking about what different intersections might mean for a particular person and what they might need. And then the other one that I can think of right now is actually around how to respond to discrimination is a big thing, because it's all well and good telling people, here's the intersections, here's what different people need to feel inclusion, here's the type of language you should be using. It still begs the question, but what happens, when I notice this situation, this HR case where, something bad has happened, or perhaps there's been discrimination, or perhaps there's been language used that is not inclusive. How do we respond to that? And so I've been seeing a lot of requests for sessions around challenging poor behaviors and frameworks for opening up that discussion.
I think that's definitely that's interesting, because I think a lot of companies also that we've talked to or worked with as well are focusing on similar topics, especially intersectionality. And I think what we were talking about earlier in terms of, really simple strategies you can do in terms of putting captions on your Zoom videos or your marketing content, making sure that it is closed captioned as well, helps a variety of different folks too. So it's important to have that mindset lens and training in mind. I always like to ask too in these interviews, as a call to action for folks who are listening to our conversation today. If they are thinking, I want to be more of an equity champion, I want to make sure my organization is more equitable, no matter if they sit on, the people, diversity, equity, and inclusion, legal compliance, employee resource group leader, any person who's a formal and informal leader at the company, wherever they are in their journey, if they're just starting out. Yeah. What advice do you have for them, or what do you hope that they kind of do?
Yeah, I think, when I think about, the things that I would suggest to someone in terms of, wanting to build that equity champion mindset, is I think the biggest challenge for people, I have a generally positive outlook on life, and I think people are inherently good. It's just normally a case of a lack of education or ignorance, or, maybe being around some poor influences that creates a lack of inclusion. And so for me, a great place to start is around, starting to discover some of your blind spots, because I think we all have them. And so one tool that, I found super useful, you might be aware of this one, Christina, is the Harvard Implicit Awareness Test, which is a quiz that you sort of go through. It's completely free. You just need to Google the name and go through the quiz. And then what it does is that it gives you a report on some of the areas where you might want to pay more attention to in terms of becoming an equity champion. So an area could be, it might be your view on disability inclusion, or your view with ethnic inclusion, right? And so once you have that report, you can then start to build a plan to address some of those blind spots. And the plan doesn't have to be anything, dramatic and scary, because I know there's people listening to this thinking, oh gosh, so what do I do if I discover I have all of these different biases and all of these different things that I need to work on? You just pick one of them. And even if you start by, let's say watching a TED talk on disability inclusion, right? By the way, I recommend my own TED talk for that one. So, you just do that as a starting point, and already you're starting to to address, some of those gaps, some of that knowledge, perhaps because it's not an area that you've been exposed to before, or perhaps it's not something that, you've not had many touch points, perhaps with people from the disabled community. So the tool helps you identify that, and then you can start to decide what your education and your action is going to look like to move the needle forward for you within that.
Absolutely. I think those are good kind of starting points and good calls to action. And Winston Clements, thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture this afternoon.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, and as a reminder for folks who are listening at AllVoices, we believe employee feedback is critical to the success of the company, and that really all voices need to be heard. Have a good rest of your afternoon, everyone.